Welcome to It's Not About the Money, a podcast in search of grounded fundraising. I'm Heather, and together with my co-host Andy, we look beyond the quick tips and formulas. Join us as we explore the nuance and complexity of ministry fundraising. If you want to thrive in partner development, not just survive it, this is the place for you.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. So excited to have with us Meg Craig, joining us today to recap the Scott Morton episode. I was so bummed to have missed that, but I think Andrew did a great job.
He did.
Yeah. So Heather, will you tell us about our guest today?
Absolutely. I would love to, Andy. So we met Meg actually back in April at a Support Raising Leaders Conference, actually the same conference that we met Nelson Musipa at, which that episode shall be coming in the next few weeks.
And Scott Morton himself.
Yeah. But actually, our conversation with Scott started before that, but that's where we were able to land shaking his hand, saying thank you in person.
Yeah.
All that to say, we met the lovely Meg Craig at that conference, and she was sitting at my table. And throughout the week, I got to know her a little bit more, heard a bit about her story, and I thought she would just be a great voice to speak to this recap. So Meg, we would love to give the mic to you to share a bit about your experience, how you ended up in support-based work, and a little about your story.
Yeah, of course. I'm excited to be on here and hang out with you guys and talk about Scott Morton's episode. So I started out in campus-based ministry in 2015, which feels like a lifetime ago, honestly. I started out as a campus missionary intern, which is just our internship program. And I did that for a year. We had to raise like what I would call like change now, considering what I raise now, and got to work that year. I wasn't sure about ministry. I always wanted to be a teacher and work overseas in a South American country and then just live there, teach English, learn Spanish, and be there.
Yeah.
That was my heart, my desire, and God had different plans for me. And so when I started as an intern, I thought this would just be a year-long thing. And actually, through that time as an intern, God really just showed me that he was calling me to be someone who equipped and sent others rather than being the person who was sent. And it took me a long time to really embrace that, but I love it. I love getting to disciple and equip college students to share the gospel, not only in other places, but also on their campus with their families and just across the world. It's been really just a joy to get to be a part of that. But I didn't know what it would take to do this until I said yes to doing campus ministry. I was told when I sat down and told them that I would do it, they told me that I would need to raise support. And I do not come from a family of ministry people or missionaries, so I had no idea what that would look like. And God just gave me a desire to do that. And I was like, okay, I'll do what it takes. You've asked me to do this. I know you'll provide for me if this is what you're asking of me. So I went to a training, felt really equipped at that training. I was given Scott Morton's book, How to Fund Your Ministry. I was given like the God Asked by Steve Shadrach. So just had a couple different books given to me and got training and raised my support. And I got to about 90%. And then like school started, I got jumped in and I was like, it's fine. That other money will come in. And it didn't. So I had to take a step back in the spring and finish raising my support. And the Lord definitely provided and got to see him do that. But throughout that whole year of support raising or not that year of support raising, but that year of ministry, living on support, it was really challenging because within our organization, I was one of 5 people who had started raising support. Our organization did not have people who raised support.
Okay.
And that was a very big deal. Everybody else on our staffs were funded through funding from the convention. I worked for a convention ministry, BSM. And so all of our funding came through there. And that was fine. I was okay with that. Like I knew this is what God wanted me to do. I didn't mind that other people were being funded a different way. That didn't bother me.
You were willing to be a pioneer.
Exactly. And so essentially, though, there was no structure, there was no help, there was no guidance. And I was not okay with that for the people we were going to ask to do that the next year.
Mm-hmm.
So I approached our director and just shared like, hey, I think we need to be doing some things differently. And I saw this conference that we could go to. And he was like, okay, great. We're going to do that. You're going to become a facilitator for this. And it was basically like full steam ahead. You're going to be the pioneer of this. And as I kind of got into the weeds, I learned like one of the reasons why we started having support-based staff was because the vision was bigger than the dollar amount that we had. And I think we wanted to see the thousands of college students in Texas reached. And we weren't even reaching half of the campuses in Texas with the workers that we had.
Let's say that again, Meg. So you went from a salaried type of position to a fundraised position because the vision was too big.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. We had this vision that was bigger than what we were funded for, essentially.
Yeah.
We were reaching less than half the campuses in Texas, and we wanted to see that number grow. We wanted to better reach the campuses we were already on by having more staff on those campuses. And so that sent our organization on a journey of adopting not only salaried employees through like convention giving, but also employees that raise their support and are funded through that means. And so we kind of have this hybrid model. That's what we have right now. And it's working for us. It's been 10 years since we started that journey, and I've gotten to see people embrace support raising who didn't before. I've gotten to see our organization, like our parent organization, really embrace this and see that this is going to be a way that we reach the campuses in Texas, and it could be a way that we expand even our mission and ministries in the future. Yeah. So it's really just been a crucial thing for our organization. And I think for me, I didn't share this earlier, but when I was going to my first training, I didn't prepare for it. Like, you're supposed to do all this homework. I didn't do the homework. I was busy doing ministry. That was beneath me. And which is not true. You should definitely do the homework.
Do your homework,
people
kids.
Sign you. Yes. But on our drive to Arkansas, which was where we were doing the training, I did do all the Bible study pieces. And that really transformed my heart. Like God's word changed my heart and helped me to better understand, one, that this was biblical, and two, that God would provide. And I think as somebody who didn't have any kind of experience or concept of this idea of raising support to live and do ministry, that biblical foundation was what kept me going and what helped me to know that this was what our organization also needed to do, and gave me just a solid ground to stand on, really, of why we needed to do this and move in this direction.
Right.
So
it just addresses so many of those obstacles that people have, and those questions of conscience that Scott talked about up front. Yeah. It's great.
Yeah. Okay. A couple of things I really love about hearing your story. The first is that it just seems like at every step of the way, it wasn't quite what you thought, but you just had an emphatic yes. You know, like at first, maybe you were like, I have a vision and heart for teaching in another like cross-cultural context. And the Lord was like, actually, we're going to go over here. And you're like, okay. And then, you know, you kind of get rolling into a ministry where you raise, as you said, change in comparison to the full
latte money.
Yeah, latte money. No, latte money for the student that you're taking out. Yes. And then again, it kind of shifted, and you're like, okay, let's go. And so I just really love that. Yeah. I just really love that spirit of obedience and willingness, and I think that that's really beautiful.
It sounds like she was the right person for the job.
Sounds like it, yeah. So, and she's actually like, you know, through all of this, because you've had such because it's impressed upon your heart the importance of the process and just the belief that God will provide, you now work coaching others, right?
Yeah. So I've gotten to move from not just helping strategize and plan and coordinate and train, but also as people raise their support, getting to walk with them in their journey of doing that. And that is so fun to me. I just really enjoyed getting to walk with people. And, I think I had people who teared up and cried because they were like, God was working in their heart in a lot of ways of
Yeah.
letting go of maybe some of the fears that they had, but then also getting to see people be in awe of God providing for them. Like, they step into it, they're like, okay, we'll see where this goes. That's kind of like the attitude some people had. And to see God provide and see them go, wow, God did that. Like, and I'm like, yes, like it's so cool just to get to see people be in awe of the Lord. And I think that support raising really equips you for what you're going to face in ministry. So for
Yes.
people who do that and then they step into ministry and maybe it doesn't go exactly how they planned, or there are fears there, or they get to see these moments of awe of God, like this support raising really paves the way for that, for
Yeah.
growth, I guess. So
Yeah, we agree 100%.
And that's kind of an unexpected, I think, benefit from this job. I did not anticipate from the very beginning is that you have the privilege of leading people through formation. And that is fundamentally what fundraising does. Well, should we jump into some recap here?
Let's roll.
I feel like what I was impressed with from the beginning, right from the beginning, was that, wow, Scott sounds like so many of us when we first started fundraising. Like so many of his initial hang-ups and thought processes just sounded so familiar to me.
Okay, I was about to be confused because I thought Scott sounded very articulate and well-spoken, and that is not how I sounded when I was initially fundraising. But you're talking about the mistakes.
The way that he was thinking, like the way that he was approaching fundraising.
Got it.
Like,
okay.
I'm just going to pray the money in.
Yeah.
Like that kind of a thought, and that kind of an approach, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
I 100% agree. I was thinking, wow. Well, one, I was just so impressed because Scott has been paving the way for this for a long time.
Right.
But two, like to hear his story of starting out and just even some of the things I said to myself or thought or said to others, like that he also did. I was like, I'm really glad I wasn't alone in this.
Yeah.
Right. It's important to know that he's already thought through this. He's started at the same point and arrived at a different point, and he's thought through it all already. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so I know, Meg, you mentioned that when you did your training, you also got a copy of his book. I'm curious because as I mentioned in the episode with Scott, that was the primary tool that was given to me when I started on my journey of support-based ministry. And I thought it was an excellent book. I don't know if you had the same experience, but at the time, the book had a person with a ball and chain on it. And I felt like that was just the worst way to sum up what he was saying.
Oh, man. I can picture it.
I have that book. It's like a workbook size.
Yeah.
It's not like a book, like a smaller book. And it does have the ball and chain. And I did not read his book. I feel terrible saying that. I will say this. I have read several of his other books. So I've read Blind Spots. I've read the devotional book. And then I'm not very good at titles, but the one on money that's for everybody.
Right.
So I've read those books. I just didn't read that book. But I have also listened to a lot of Scott's videos on his website. So I've utilized those a lot in coaching. And I think a lot of those things are what's from the book. Like Scott said, he built that book from his lectures and teachings about this, which I think I'm getting the same information that was in the book. Probably. I don't know. I
Oh,
haven't
yeah.
read it.
Oh, yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm curious whether you didn't read it because it had a person with a ball and
Oh,
chain.
that's tough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the reason I didn't read it was because I was trying to finish the God Asked by Steve Shadrach, and it looked like a lot. Like I don't know why his book looked like a lot. Like it was, and I'm sure it's an amazing book. And I think now I'm definitely going to go back and read it because I feel like the next time I see Scott Morton
Yeah.
at a conference or something, I want to tell him that I read his
Yeah.
book.
Yeah. Good.
Well, it actually is a lot. But as Andy said, I mean, he has done such extensive work in Bible study and in practical instruction that there's just so much rich resources that he has provided in that book. So I do think, as you said, that a lot of those resources come across in different mediums, like in videos and things like that in his website. And certainly some of those found their way into our conversation with him. But it is an excellent resource to have, even if on the shelf, to pull out when you kind of have a specific topic that you're wanting to engage in.
For sure.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
sure. I think like on that note, one of the things I was the most impressed, and that just as even talking to Scott, I've met him once in person. I've been to a breakout he's done. He really looks to God more than he looks to what others have done before him or around him in regards to support raising. He really seeks out scripture. And I just learned from him in his episode how much more I need to be doing that. Like it was just this sweet reminder of I need to be pursuing what God's word teaches me about this when I have questions. And I think there's so many people who have done that. So they are great resources like Scott himself, but also being intentional when I have questions or concerns or fears to do what Scott modeled for us, which is what Jesus modeled for us, which is to pursue the Lord and seek answers from his word and prayer and being intentional in that way. So,
yeah, I think that's a great point because I think that there have been such great resources kind of out there for support-based workers to engage for a while now. And I think sometimes when we are just looking to the resource, it can kind of become a formula, right? It's kind of like, okay, well, they say to do this, so I'm going to do this. And that's where I think it stops forming us and we just conform to what other people have said to do. And so I actually think it's really healthy to take those resources and then yourself to just continually go back to the word or go back in prayer and submit yourself to being formed and not just conform to the way other people have done it, which honestly is probably going to have a lot of the same tools that you will use. But there's just really an important element of your posture in doing those things, right?
You need to wrestle through it.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. You need to figure out like, why am I resisting this?
Right.
And let's deal with that. Yeah.
There's a book by Henry Nouwen.
Yeah.
And now I can't remember the title
Spirituality
of it.
Spirituality of Fundraising?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. And that book, I read that book like 3 years ago, and that was very formative for me because I think it put together some pieces for me of that, of fundraising is an act of worship to the Lord. And that may not be something that everybody does as an act of worship in terms of I'm raising support, but how we deal with our money and manage those things, whether we're a support raiser and we're asking people to partner with us or we're giving or we're spending, like all of those things, that's an act of worship to the Lord. And so I need to be intentional to pursue the Lord in the midst of that and not just utilize a formula or a tool or a technique to make it better. So
yeah, absolutely.
I think another thing that struck me from the beginning of his story as he was relating like his personal journey and process, and that I think probably a lot of us can relate to, is that he came to the end of himself. And he just, and maybe it was even his wife just confronting him saying like, our savings is gone. Are you going to provide for us? Like what's happening here? And so he had a unique situation. I think a lot of us, like, we can try it on our own and we can think to ourselves, well, you know, again, George Mueller did it and he didn't have to ask anybody. So, but I feel like he's kind of an outlier. And there's a good chance that God is asking you to do it another way, and to actually,
Yeah.
like Steve Shadwick would say, to mobilize your network, to mobilize the local church.
Mm-hmm.
But I see that time and time again in people that I coach. The Lord brings them to the end of themselves, to a place
Yeah.
where they're just so broken, where like, Lord, if you don't work, this isn't going to happen.
Mm. But what a kindness, to be
Absolutely.
positioned to see, wow, that was God.
Yeah.
That was 0% me, 100% him,
Yeah, we need that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I agree. And I think one of the things that Scott emphasized several times in his episode is praying about funding. And he talks about this a lot. And he talks about, I think it's in Matthew 5, with the Lord's Prayer and praying for your daily needs and praying for your support, like for raising support every day. And I was like, I do not do that. And that was really, listening to that in that episode was very impactful for me as a reminder of praying for that daily. But I think beyond that, like Scott really emphasizes this, that prayer is the foundation of what we do. And in support raising, it is a foundation for us, and it should be something we do consistently and regularly, whether or not we're in a season of raising support to go on mission or coming home and raising maybe some more support, or our daily walk with God in living on support. Like praying about that is a key and something we should do, because I think what Scott says about praying for your daily bread, which he learned from a friend, is really crucial.
Yeah. I feel like prayer is one of those things that's pretty easy to take for granted, just because, especially if you've been in the church for a long time, it's just always part of our environment. Like we're always talking about prayer, but it's not a guarantee. It shouldn't be assumed that we're always doing it. And perhaps because it is so kind of ubiquitous, we just assume that we are, but we actually aren't. We have to be really intentional with that.
Yeah. One of the things that also really stood out to me that Scott talked about was, he did not say it this way, but this is how I like to say it: when we say no for people, when we ask, when we are looking at maybe their circumstances, or we are making a list of people and we're like, oh, that person won't give, so we don't even put them on our prayer list, or we don't put them on our list of people to approach. And I think that is something, when I was coaching people, I ran into a lot, was they were like, oh, I don't think they'll give, or, oh, I don't want to put this person on my list because they're not doing well, or what, like financially. And I remember talking to several people and saying, when you talk to people about Christ, do you say no for them? Like, are you basically not approaching someone because you think they won't want to know? And they're like, no, of course I wouldn't do that. And I'm like, okay, then why are you doing that in this space? And so we're having that conversation of saying no for people is not posturing yourself in a place of trust to the Lord. And I think that's something that Scott talks about. I can't remember what part he talked about that in, but that was something that really stood out to me.
Nice.
Yeah, I think that was in maybe his second caution of too small of a mailing list, because you've essentially self-selected people out. Yeah. I thought that his first caution, don't hint, or I guess the way he said it was the failure because you're always hinting about money and never directly asking.
Huge.
I thought that one was really, really good. I mean, I think I see that a lot, where there's kind of an assumption that if you tell people about what you're doing, that
out of the
will
goodness
kind of like
of their heart.
Right. That will naturally set them up to say something, which sometimes it does. Sometimes it does, but I think that it's not a great strategy to just always hope that kind of beating around the bush is going to get you somewhere.
And I know nobody thinks of it as though they are beating around the bush.
Right.
They're trying to be, gentle,
sensitive,
and sensitive, and don't want to offend anybody. But honestly, like who's if you're talking to somebody who is offended by that, they're not going to give anyways.
Mm.
I see this a lot actually in career missionaries. I see a tendency just to keep hinting. And it's hard when you know that their funding is in jeopardy. But it's still hard. Like that is an entrenched habit just to kind of keep hinting.
Well, and it's interesting. It's interesting because even in kind of this current space I'm in, where I have the privilege of discussing these things on a podcast with you and holding these topics out, I have several friends that have recently made decisions to go and are seeking support. And as we talk about it, they don't ever ask me.
Right.
And I haven't like made a hard and fast rule that like I'm not, because of what I do feel a little bit like, okay, I want to see you ask,
Yeah, right.
But I don't have like a hard and fast rule that I won't ask if you don't or that I won't give if you don't ask or whatever.
Right.
But it is interesting because I think that because people know that I'm really comfortable talking about this and really familiar with this, it has seemed to create a decrease in people directly talking to me about it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe they think that you're evaluating them.
Maybe, but I'm not.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is just interesting. And so I guess maybe, listener, what we're saying is, hey, with some of the people that like get it the most, even those people, it's good to like specifically invite them.
And they probably aren't over asked.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And wouldn't you rather ask than say no for them? Like, I think it's the concept, that same kind of concept. I've experienced the same thing, Heather. And I think sometimes it's frustrating to me because I'm like, I actually have been thinking about this a lot, but you haven't asked me about this at all. And maybe I do want to partner with you. And, but you haven't talked to me about it. So how would I know that you need that?
Sure.
So,
yeah.
I think sometimes the default assumption for a lot of donors or a lot of people in your network is they'll ask me if they really need it. Otherwise, I assume that their needs are taken care of.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I do want to give one caveat because I do actually think there is one consideration here that's important to mention, and that's just that there really are some cultures where direct asks are considered inappropriate or not received well. And it's not because people aren't inclined to give. It's just that culturally, that's not the most appropriate way to express that invitation. And so, listener, if you find yourself coming from a cultural background that it actually is less appropriate to directly ask, and you're not hinting, but you're finding other ways of expressing that invitation, we are not trying to invalidate that. We're speaking more from a context where kind of assuming that culturally directness is a cultural value.
Yeah. Good point. Good distinction.
Yeah. That is a good distinction for sure.
Okay, this isn't necessarily one of the points that he made, but I just wanted to say that I was so encouraged and impressed by the way Scott carried himself. And I think that, okay, so this is a little behind the scenes, pull back the curtain. I edit our episodes, and I think Scott Morton is the least edited person on the history of the podcast. Wow. And I think that's because he is articulate and he is well-spoken, and he has been speaking to these ideas for many, many years. But I also think it's because just at a deep soul level, he has conviction that he's able to speak to really well. And so I think that is an example of when we are passionate about something and we have conviction, and honestly, we're just really sure of who God is and what our part is in that. It frees us up to be able to speak without a lot of editing,
it overflows.
Yeah, it overflows. Yeah.
Yeah. I really appreciated Scott Morton's gems of some scripts that he kind of said to people. So he talked about a couple of different ways that he would say something to a partner or to a potential partner. So if you are listening to this, I highly recommend going back and pulling those out because I am going to be using some of those as well.
Yeah.
I just thought that some of the maybe examples that he gave were really sweet. They were direct, but they were gentle. And I really appreciated that. So as someone who's about to enter into another season of support raising, I am definitely going to re-listen to his episodes so I can pull those out.
Nice.
So
Yeah, he really modeled a lot of great communication.
That's a great distinction you
Sure.
bring up, Meg, that just because something is direct doesn't mean it has to be abrasive.
Yeah.
Right? It can be direct and gentle at the same time. Yeah, that's a great point.
And I think that the last thing that I would say, Scott Morton said this when he was talking about grace. He was talking about how grace is a supernatural enablement to do what must be done, whether you feel like it or not. And I really appreciated that, because there is so much grace from the Lord that goes into our time raising support. And even as we live and minister on support, that God's grace abounds, that even sometimes we don't see, but just the grace that he gives us to be able to do this, even when we don't feel like it, or when it's challenging, was just Scott's description of that was very impactful to me, and a good reminder of what grace is, not only in support raising, but just in life. So,
yeah.
Yes, I really love that God's provision does not depend on us being optimized, but comes in correspondence with our obedience. And sometimes even despite our obedience. You know, you said grace. There's so much grace over the Lord's provision to us. I mean, I just think of like his provision to the Israelites when they were kind of whining about wanting to go back to Egypt. I think of his provision to Elijah when Elijah was like, I'm done. I just want to die now, even though I just saw you like school the prophets of Baal and send down fire. I'm done. I can't do anymore. And God shows up through an angel and provides him food and rest and then vision to keep going, you know? So I really think that savoring the Lord's grace in this whole process is so important.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
And you pointed out that the grace is that he inspires you or he pulls you along in doing something that you don't necessarily want to do. And I can think of several things in my life where I don't always want to do it. I don't always want to go to this event, or I don't always want to go to, in my experience, an English corner, because I used to be a teacher, because it was on a bad time of the week and it was above and beyond my duties, extracurricular, whatever. But I was always happy I went. And there's always like, I feel like my wife is almost like my Holy Spirit in this case. Like she's encouraging me to go to these events that I don't necessarily want to go to, but I'm like, okay, you're right. That was good. And so I think like this is a very direct correlation with fundraising. Like you might not want to do it right away, but it's going to be good. You're going to be happy that you did it.
Yeah.
Okay, one last thing from me before we wrap up. At the very end, when he was kind of wrapping up the different things he would caution people not to do, he said that the failure to listen is one that he would call out. And I actually think that that's really great. And this is just another reminder. You know, I said that Scott was really able to share passionately because he had a lot of conviction. And I think sometimes we're not listening because we're so in our heads concerned about how we sound or whether we're going to offend, and we're just not free. We're not free to listen because we've got all these maybe questions of conscience or insecurities or doubts. And so I think that's why it's just so important to do the work of working through your perceived obstacles, actual obstacles, the ways that you view fundraising, you know, to go back to something that you said earlier about just how impactful it was for you to do, like to just study the word and to look at what the word said and have that shape the way you viewed fundraising. I just really encourage people to put the time into the biblical foundations of what the word says about fundraising, you know, indirectly or directly, what God says about himself, what God has like modeled about his provision for his people throughout time. And also, what baggage and assumptions and misconceptions are you bringing in about fundraising? All of those things are going to be an initial part of fundraising training, kind of delving into the foundations. And I would just say, if you find yourself consistently unable to listen or unable to just speak freely from a place of conviction, I would encourage you to go back to the foundations. Make sure that you're on a solid foundation and you're freed up in those ways.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, good point. Great. Well, thanks for joining us today, everybody. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Meg, for taking some time out to help us recap that episode.
Yeah, it was so fun. Thanks for having me, y'all. I really appreciated and enjoyed my time with you guys.
All right. Well, thank you, listeners, and we'll catch you next time.
See you next time. It's Not About the Money is presented by Provisio Fundraising Solutions. Provisio equips support-based workers with flexible training, practical resources, and one-on-one coaching. Find out more at provisiofundraising.com.